Imagine stepping onto a plane with excitement in your heart, ready for a peaceful journey, only to find yourself pulled into a nightmare you never saw coming. Harold and Clara Bennett, a devoted elderly couple, boarded Flight 761 with smiles and dreams of celebrating their lifelong love above the clouds. But what should have been a serene, first-class experience quickly spiraled into chaos. A seemingly ordinary request from a flight attendant ignited a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Words like non-compliant and disruptive echoed down the aisle. Security was called. Phones emerged. Moments later, the calm of the cabin shattered, leaving Clara terrified and Harold fighting for dignity and justice. How did a simple flight turn into a public battle against discrimination and bias? Could one couple's ordeal spark a conversation about fairness, empathy, and accountability? And who bears the responsibility when rules overshadow humanity? Join us as we unravel this extraordinary story of love, courage, and the fight for justice in the skies. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can follow every twist of this gripping journey. The airport terminal shimmered with its usual rhythm that evening. Screens flashed departure times. Rolling suitcases clattered against polished floors. Somewhere in the distance, an intercom voice announced boarding for another flight bound for Europe. Among the constant noise, two figures moved quietly, hand in hand, steadying their pace. Dr. Harold Bennett adjusted the strap of his leather carry-on, the same bag he had carried for nearly 20 years of conferences and seminars. His other hand held firmly onto Clara's. She was dressed in a pale blue shawl, her silver hair pulled neatly into a bun. The couple had always walked this way, close enough to feel each other's presence, close enough that a stranger might mistake them for newlyweds despite the years etched across their faces. This wasn't just another trip. For Harold and Clara, Aerosky Airways Flight 761 represented something more tender, almost sacred. It was their 45th wedding anniversary, a milestone neither of them took lightly. Paris had been Clara's dream since her youth, a city of cobblestones, cafes, and quiet art museums. Harold had planned everything meticulously. First-class tickets, a private car waiting in Charles de Gaulle, a hotel overlooking the Seine, and, tucked away inside his bag, a small velvet box with earrings he had chosen weeks earlier. As they reached the gate, Harold glanced at Clara. "Are you ready for France?" he asked softly. Her lips curved into a smile that carried decades of shared life. "I've been ready since the day you proposed," she whispered. The agent scanned their boarding passes. For a brief moment, her eyes flickered between the names on the screen and the faces standing in front of her. Harold caught at the pause, the quick recalculation as though the sight of two elderly black passengers in first class required an extra beat of verification. He was used to this, too used to it. Clara squeezed his hand, urging him silently not to dwell. They had weathered worse glances in worse rooms. Tonight, she wanted joy. They boarded without further issue. First class was quiet, insulated from the noise of the rest of the plane. Plush, leather seats, chilled orange juice already set on the armrests, soft music trickling from hidden speakers. Harold helped Clara with her shawl, carefully folding it before stowing it overhead. She lowered herself into the window seat, her eyes sparkling at the thought of Paris glittering beyond the horizon. He tucked their passports into the seat pocket. "All set," he murmured. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes just for a moment. "I love flying with you," she said. You just love Paris, Harold teased. Both, she replied. Her hand found his again, fingers interlocking with the ease of habit. Around them, flight attendants moved with professional efficiency, greeting passengers, adjusting luggage. One passed by their row, offered a perfunctory nod, and then cast a second glance. Another followed soon after, eyes darting for just a second too long before walking away. Harold felt the air shift ever so slightly, like the tightening of a string on a violin. Still, he brushed it aside. He had promised Clara that nothing would ruin this trip. They had survived medical school, night shifts, mortgage struggles, raising 2 children, burying parents. A sideways glance wasn't going to derail their anniversary. 15 minutes later, more passengers trickled in. A young couple entered first class, their laughter echoing a bit too loudly for the space. Nathan and Olivia Ward. Harold would later learn. They looked like they had stepped out of a glossy magazine spread designer luggage, tailored travel outfits, the kind of presence that seemed to demand attention. They exchanged a few quiet words with the crew at the front, and Harold noticed the way the attendants leaned in just a little closer, smiling more warmly than they had for anyone else. Clara shifted in her seat. "Do you think they're celebrities?" she asked, half amused. "Not the kind I'd recognize," Harold replied, glancing back down at his watch. He had timed the boarding process out of habit, the same way he measured patient recovery or monitored a heartbeat. Numbers gave him calm. Numbers were neutral, unlike stairs. For a few minutes, everything settled again. Clara sipped her juice, humming softly under her breath. Harold opened a travel guide, circling a few museums he knew she would love. Their world, their rhythm, returned. Then a shadow fell over their row. Harold looked up to find a flight attendant standing before them. Her name badge read Janet Rhodes. Her smile was polite but thin, the kind that held no real warmth. "Sir, ma'am," she began, "we'll need you to change seats. There's been an adjustment." Harold tilted his head slightly. "An adjustment." "Yes," Janet said, her tone firm but flat. "These seats are required for another couple with special accommodations." Clara blinked, puzzled. "But we paid for these seats in full. Weeks ago." "I understand," Janet replied, though her expression didn't match her words. "But this isn't up for discussion. If you'll gather your belongings, I'll show you to your new seats." Silence stretched between them. Harold closed his travel guide slowly, marking the page with deliberate care. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured. The voice of a man who had delivered news of heart surgery to anxious families. "Unless the aircraft is going down," he said evenly. "We're not moving." Janet's smile thinned further. She gave a brief nod, then retreated down the aisle. Harold watched her go, the pit in his stomach tightening. Clara reached for his hand again, her fingers trembling just slightly. "Let's not cause trouble," she whispered. "Please, it's our anniversary." Harold kissed her knuckles, steady and sure. "I'm calm, I promise. We belong here." The hum of the cabin resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Around them, passengers exchanged curious glances. A murmur rose, then fell, and somewhere near the front, Nathan and Olivia Ward laughed again, their voices carrying just enough to remind Harold of the stakes. He leaned back, eyes closed for a moment, steadying himself. Years of practice had taught him how to regulate his breathing, how to slow a racing pulse, But nothing could fully quiet the thought gnawing at the back of his mind he had seen this pattern before. The polite request, the insistence, the escalation waiting just beyond. What Harold Bennett couldn't know then, what no one in that cabin could predict, was that this quiet refusal would ignite a chain of events that stretched far beyond Aerosky Airways Flight 761. A chain that would test not only his marriage, not only his dignity, but the very system that claimed to serve all passengers equally. And it all began with a single word. No. The cabin lights dimmed as boarding slowed, a soft golden glow settling over the rows of first class. For most passengers, this was the moment to tuck away their coats, silence their phones, and slip into the anonymity of air travel. For Harold Bennett, it was something else entirely. He wasn't just traveling across the Atlantic. He was carrying 45 years of love, sacrifice, and survival in every step he took down that jet bridge. Harold had been born in a small Mississippi town where opportunity was often a rumor, not a promise. His earliest memories were of red dirt roads, church on Sundays, and his mother working double shifts just to put food on the table. Books became his escape, medicine his calling. He had studied by candlelight, applied for scholarships no one believed he would win, and boarded buses where people told him to sit in the back. By the time he reached medical school, his resolve was already granite. He wasn't just studying cardiology. He was proving, again and again, that the system could not erase him. And then there was Clara. He met her in the campus library on a rainy afternoon when the fluorescent lights flickered overhead and the smell of damp coats filled the air. She had been hunched over a stack of education textbooks, her pen moving furiously across a legal pad. Harold, usually too focused to notice anyone, found himself distracted by the quiet determination etched across her face. She looked up once, caught his stare, and smiled. That was all it took. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Within a year, they were planning a future together. Clara wanted to be a teacher. She dreamed of classrooms filled with laughter, of children discovering the joy of language and numbers. But when Harold was offered a residency program that demanded everything of him, Clara made a choice. She set aside her own ambitions, not because she lacked them, but because she believed in Harold's. She believed in what he could become, and she believed in them as a unit. Together, they could endure anything. That sacrifice, quiet and uncelebrated, became the backbone of their marriage. 45 years later, they had built a life of stability and quiet triumph. Harold had risen to become one of the most respected cardiologists in Newark, a physician whose patients sent him Christmas cards, whose name carried weight in both hospitals and community centers. Clara had become his anchor, raising their 2 children, creating a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of gentle discipline that turned children into adults who carried kindness into the world. This anniversary trip to Paris was more than a vacation. It was a chapter marker, a celebration of a journey filled with both hardship and joy. Harold had planned it down to the last detail: a chauffeured car to the airport, a boutique hotel with a view of the Eiffel Tower, tickets to a chamber concert in an old church Clara had once read about in a magazine. And of course, the surprise he had hidden in his luggage, a pair of pearl earrings, chosen to match the necklace he had given her on their 30th anniversary. He imagined the way her face would light up when he opened the box in a quiet Paris cafe. As Clara leaned against him in the airplane seat, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder. Harold thought about the years they had weathered, the late nights when he stumbled home from surgeries, the mornings when Clara packed his bag with an extra sandwich, knowing he would skip lunch for another patient, the funerals they had attended together, the birthdays they had celebrated, the grandchildren who now called them Nana and Papa. Every wrinkle on her face was a story, every gray hair a testament to endurance. And tonight, as they prepared for takeoff, Harold felt gratitude heavy in his chest. He had not been an easy man to love, but Clara had loved him anyway. Around them, the cabin filled with the murmurs of fellow passengers. Some were business travelers tapping at laptops, others couples exchanging quiet laughter. A flight attendant passed by again, pausing for just a second too long as she glanced at Harold and Clara. Harold noticed, though he pretended not to. He had grown accustomed to these small moments of disbelief, the suggestion that first class was reserved for others, not for people who looked like them. But tonight, he promised himself, he would not let suspicion steal his peace. He brushed his thumb across Clara's knuckles, grounding himself in the simple fact that they were here, together. And that was all that mattered. Still, somewhere beneath his calm exterior, unease stirred. Harold had seen too much in his life to ignore the patterns. He knew how quickly a smile could become a demand, how swiftly a polite request could morph into something uglier. He tried to shake the thought away. This was their night. He owed Clara his calm, his presence, not his worry. Clara, oblivious to the undercurrents, gazed out the window. The airport lights twinkled against the glass. Little dots of gold and white scattered across the dark runway. She whispered, "Paris feels so close now." Her voice was soft, almost childlike, filled with anticipation. Harold kissed the top of her head. "We'll be walking by the Seine before you know it," he said. He wanted to believe those words. He wanted the world outside that cabin to vanish, leaving only the two of them and the promise of cobblestones and wine and laughter under foreign skies. But life had a way of intruding, of reminding them that dignity was never guaranteed, not even after 45 years of proving themselves worthy. At that very moment, near the front of the cabin, Nathan and Olivia Ward were laughing with a flight attendant. Their luggage gleamed with designer tags, their confidence filling the space like perfume. Harold caught the scene out of the corner of his eye and felt a flicker of something he didn't want to name. It wasn't jealousy, it was recognition. He had seen this before. Too, the effortless ease of those who never had to defend their place, never had to explain why they belonged. Clara followed his gaze briefly, then turned back to him. "Ignore it," she murmured. "Tonight is ours." Harold nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead. He thought about the way the gate agent had paused, the way the attendants lingered. He thought about how fragile peace could be when it rested on assumptions that had never been theirs to control. He didn't want to spoil the evening, but deep inside, he braced himself. Years of being both doctor and black man in America had taught him one hard truth sometimes. The fight finds you, whether you want it or not. He inhaled deeply, let it out slowly, and forced a smile. "Tonight is ours," he repeated. His voice was steady, but his thoughts churned. He wondered what it would cost this time to keep his promise to Clara, to give her the trip she had dreamed of. He wondered, too, what would happen if he chose not to yield, if dignity demanded more from him than he had left to give. Outside, the engines roared to life. The plane shuddered slightly, preparing for the long journey ahead. Clara tightened her grip on his hand. Harold closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not just for safe travel, but for the strength to face whatever lay beyond that horizon. He had no way of knowing that before they ever touched Parisian soil. The fight he had been bracing for would find them here, in this cabin, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, and this time the whole world would be watching. The cabin of Flight 761 hummed with that peculiar blend of anticipation and routine that defines long-haul travel. The air was cool, carrying a faint scent of coffee and freshly wiped leather. Passengers were still trickling in, dragging carry-ons, juggling phones, and searching overhead compartments for space. The muffled sound of the boarding door opening and closing punctuated the atmosphere like a slow metronome. Harold Bennett sat quietly, his posture erect but not tense, one hand resting over Clara's. He had always been an observer. Years of practicing medicine had trained him to notice details others missed: the slight discoloration of a patient's fingertips, the faint irregularity of a heartbeat, the unspoken tension in a family member's voice. Tonight, that instinct extended beyond the realm of hospitals. He noticed the way two flight attendants conferred near the galley, their voices hushed though their eyes occasionally darted toward his row. He noticed how the laughter near the front of the cabin always seemed to swell louder when Nathan and Olivia Ward spoke, as if the staff themselves were eager to amplify it. Clara, by contrast, seemed blissfully focused on the view outside her window. Beyond the thick glass, airport lights spread across the tarmac like a constellation. Planes lined up in quiet choreography as a ground crew zipped between them in neon vests. She smiled softly, lost in the thought that each blinking light represented someone else's story, someone else's journey. "Do you think the city will look like the postcard?" she asked suddenly, her voice low. Harold turned to her, caught off guard by the childlike tone in her question. "Better," he said after a pause. "Postcards never capture the smell of fresh bread or the sound of a violin in the street." She laughed quietly. "You always say things like that, like you've lived everywhere. Just imagination." Harold replied, "And hope." For a moment, their little world felt untouched. The cabin could have been any space, a cocoon for two people who had already traveled a lifetime together, but the subtle signals kept pulling Harold back. Another attendant walked past, offering drinks with a smile that faltered the second her eyes landed on them. A businessman seated across the aisle glanced over, then quickly pretended to scroll his phone. It was the kind of tension Harold knew too well, invisible to anyone who didn't live inside it. He shifted slightly, pulling out a notebook he carried everywhere. Its pages were filled with scribbled reminders, sketches of ideas, even little notes Clara had left him over the years. He opened it now, partly to anchor himself, partly to remind himself of something deeper. The words on the first page stared back at him, written in his own hand many months ago. "Dignity is not negotiable." He felt the weight of those words settle into him. He wondered, not for the first time, how many times in his life he had been asked to trade dignity for convenience, for peace, for safety. Too many. And tonight, in this cabin, he feared the same request might be coming again. Clara shifted, sensing the change in him. She placed her free hand on his arm. "Don't drift away on me," she said gently. "I'm here," Harold assured her. "Always here." The boarding process dragged on. A mother with two small children struggled with her stroller, apologizing profusely as she squeezed down the aisle. A tall man in a tailored suit bumped into Harold's shoulder without looking back. A young woman, Emily Vargas, though Harold did not know her name yet, took her seat a few rows back, earbuds dangling from her ears. She noticed more than most, her eyes sharp and restless. Later, she would play a role Harold could not yet imagine. For now, she simply adjusted her phone in her lap, ready to record almost instinctively. The captain's voice broke through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're just a few minutes from closing the boarding door. Flight time to Paris tonight is 7 hours and 40 minutes. Sit back, relax, and we'll be on our way shortly." Clara squeezed Harold's hand in excitement. "Paris by morning," she whispered. Harold smiled, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the memory of the gate agent's pause, or the way Janet Rhodes had looked at them earlier with something that was not quite hospitality. He knew Clara wanted this trip unmarred, but he had lived long enough to recognize when trouble was gathering. He could almost feel it, like a storm pressing against the windows. He tried to imagine alternatives. Maybe he was reading too much into it. Maybe the attendants' glances were nothing more than routine checks. Maybe Nathan and Olivia Ward were simply charming, and the crew was doing what crews always did, catering to those who demanded attention. Maybe. Yet Harold's instincts, honed by decades of listening to unspoken signals, told him otherwise. He thought about his patients, about the countless times he had warned them to listen to their bodies, to pay attention to the quiet signs before they became emergencies. He realized he was doing the same thing now, listening not with a stethoscope, but with memory, with lived experience. He was diagnosing the atmosphere of the cabin, and the prognosis was troubling. Clara leaned back, closing her eyes, her hand still laced with his, her breathing slowed, steady, almost meditative. Harold studied her face, memorizing the lines around her mouth, the softness of her eyelids. He thought about the years she had carried his burdens, the way she had stood by him when others doubted. He promised himself again, silently this time, that he would shield her from anything that threatened this trip. But he also knew that some battles chose you, regardless of your readiness. A flight attendant wheeled a cart down the aisle, offering pre-flight drinks. She paused briefly at their row, her smile tight. "Champagne or water?" she asked. "Water, please," Harold replied. Clara requested the same. The glasses clinked lightly as they were set on the tray. The attendant lingered just a moment, then moved on without another word. Harold sipped, the cool liquid calming his throat but not his mind. He could feel Clara watching him. "Don't retreat into your head," she said softly. "Stay here with me." He nodded. "I'm here." But even as he spoke, his mind replayed the moments at the gate, the subtle shifts in tone, the lingering stares. He reminded himself of his own words written in his notebook. Dignity is not negotiable. If the moment came, if they were asked to yield again, he would have to choose. The engines rumbled louder now, a steady vibration building beneath their feet. The cabin crew moved with brisk efficiency, checking seat belts, closing overhead bins, ensuring the cabin was secure. Janet Rhodes passed by once more, her eyes grazing Harold's row, then snapping away as if burned by contact. Harold followed her with his gaze, steady, unflinching. He wondered if she knew who he was. Not just a passenger, not just a man in seat 1A, but a physician who had dedicated his life to saving others. A man who had delivered news of survival and loss with equal steadiness. He wondered if it mattered. In his experience, it rarely did. To some, he would never be anything more than what his skin declared before his words could. Clara opened her eyes again, sensing the shift in him. "Whatever it is, let it go," she whispered, "at least for tonight." Harold smiled faintly, leaned closer, and kissed her temple. "For you, I'll try." But deep inside, he knew that trying might not be enough. He could almost hear the ticking of a clock, each second drawing them closer to something inevitable. The cabin, with its quiet hum and carefully arranged luxury, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. And as the plane began its slow pushback from the gate, Harold Bennett sat in silence, watching the lights of the runway glide past, wondering if the peace he promised his wife could survive the flight ahead. The cabin doors closed with a hollow thud, sealing the passengers into their airborne world. The engines roared louder, a steady vibration humming beneath the floor. Clara settled into her seat, clutching Harold's hand with quiet excitement as the plane taxied down the runway. For a few precious minutes, everything seemed as it should. The hum of anticipation, the announcements, the tilt of the aircraft as it lifted into the night sky, all the rituals of flight fell into place. But just as the wheels left the ground, Harold noticed Janet Rhodes, the lead attendant, moving purposefully down the aisle. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were sharp, trained on row 1. Harold felt Clara shift slightly beside him, sensing the approach before Janet even spoke. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett," Janet said, her tone clipped and professional. "I'll need you both to relocate to different seats. There's been an adjustment to our manifest." Harold turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. His voice was calm, almost casual. What kind of adjustment? Janet's lips pressed into a thin line. "We need to accommodate another couple with special circumstances. They'll require these seats. Your new seats are also in business class. Very comfortable. You'll still arrive in Paris on time." Clara blinked, her confusion etched clearly across her face. "We paid for these seats in full, weeks ago. Why would we need to move? I understand your concern," Janet replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But these changes happen from time to time. It's standard procedure." Harold's gaze didn't waver. He spoke slowly, with the precision of a surgeon explaining a difficult prognosis. "Unless this aircraft is experiencing a malfunction. My wife and I are remaining in the seats we purchased. We are not moving." The words hung in the air, sharper than they sounded. A passenger across the aisle turned his head slightly, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Further back, Emily Vargas, the young woman with earbuds, slid her phone into her lap, thumb hovering over the record button almost instinctively. Janet hesitated, her professional mask cracking for just a moment. She wasn't used to being refused. Not like this. Not by someone who delivered the refusal with such unwavering calm. She straightened, nodded briskly, and retreated toward the galley. Harold exhaled, long and measured, then turned back to Clara. "It's fine," he whispered. "We're fine." But Clara's hand trembled in his. "Please, Harold, I don't want a scene. Not tonight." He squeezed gently. "There won't be. I promise." The plane leveled into its ascent. Trays rattled as overhead bins settled. Passengers reclined into their seats. Earbuds slid in. Books opened. To the casual eye, it was just another flight across the Atlantic. But for Harold, every detail sharpened into focus. The way Janet whispered with another attendant at the front. The sideways glance from Nathan Ward, who had just unbuckled his belt and stretched with the entitlement of someone certain of his place. The hushed murmur that rippled briefly through the cabin before dissolving again into silence. Minutes later, Janet returned. This time, she wasn't alone. Thomas Keene, the cabin supervisor, followed closely behind. He was taller, his presence heavier, his expression carrying an authority meant to leave little room for negotiation. "Mr. Bennett," Thomas began, voice low but firm. "We're going to ask you once more to relocate to your reassigned seats. This isn't a request. It's an operational necessity." Harold looked up, his jaw tightening, though his tone remained steady. "With all due respect, sir, this is not an operational matter. My wife and I paid for these seats. She's not in the best of health. We're comfortable here, and we're staying." Thomas's expression hardened. "If you refuse, you'll be considered non-compliant. Non-compliance is a violation of FAA safety regulations. We'll have no choice but to escalate this further." Clara's voice broke through, trembling. "He's done nothing wrong. Why are you doing this?" Thomas avoided her gaze, keeping his attention fixed on Harold. "Sir, this is your final chance." The air in the cabin shifted. Conversations quieted. Eyes turned discreetly toward row 1. Some passengers feigned indifference, noses buried in newspapers, but their ears strained toward the unfolding exchange. Others watched openly, their phones angled just enough to capture fragments of video. Harold felt the weight of Clara's hand clutching his arm. He looked into her eyes, saw the fear swimming there, the silent plea not to push further. For a moment, he wrestled with himself. Yielding would buy peace, at least temporarily. Yielding would ease Clara's trembling, silence the whispers, make the crew vanish back into their routines. But yielding would also mean something else, an acceptance, a surrender of dignity he had guarded for 70 years. He inhaled, steadying himself. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but resolute. "We are in the seats we purchased. We are not moving. Please stop asking." A collective hush fell over the cabin. Thomas's jaw tightened, the words non-compliant already poised on his tongue. Janet shifted beside him, her eyes darting toward Nathan and Olivia Ward, who sat just a few rows back, watching the scene with a mixture of impatience and expectation. Clara leaned closer, whispering so only Harold could hear. "Please, don't get upset. Please, it's our anniversary." Harold turned to her, his eyes soft but steady. "I'm calm, I promise." He squeezed her hand, grounding her even as the storm gathered around them. Thomas gave a curt nod, signaling the end of conversation. "Very well," he said coldly. "We'll handle this another way." He and Janet turned back toward the galley, their voices hushed but urgent as they disappeared behind the curtain. Harold sat back, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. He had been here before, in different forms, in different rooms, always the same language, always the same coded justification. Tonight, he refused to shrink. Tonight, he refused to apologize for being exactly where he belonged, around him. The cabin buzzed with low murmurs. A businessman muttered something under his breath. Emily Vargas finally pressed record on her phone, and Clara, still holding his hand, leaned into his shoulder, whispering through trembling lips. "I just want Paris. I just want us." Harold kissed her forehead, silent, unwilling to speak what he already knew. Peace was no longer theirs to control. The curtain to the galley swished shut, leaving Harold and Clara in a strange kind of silence. It wasn't quiet in the cabin. People still shuffled in their seats. The engines still roared beneath them, and the soft hum of air conditioning whispered overhead, but within their row, silence stretched like a taut wire. Clara sat rigid, her fingers intertwined with Harold's, her pulse thudding fast against his palm. He wanted to tell her everything was fine, but the words felt dishonest, flimsy against the memory of Thomas Keene's threat. Harold adjusted his watch, the old reflex of a man who measured time not just in minutes but in heartbeats. He thought about the words non-compliant and disruptive, the labels so easily thrown at people like him. He thought about patients he had treated, men and women who had collapsed in grocery store aisles, on front porches, in pews at church. He had been their calm, the anchor in chaos. But here, now, he was the one at risk of being labeled a disruption, the one seconds away from being dragged out under the sterile gaze of strangers. Clara leaned in, her whisper breaking his thoughts. "Harold, please, maybe we should just move." Her words cut him deeper than he expected. Move, yield, give up what they had rightfully paid for. He turned to her, saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen decades ago when they were newly married and pulled over on a dark road for no reason other than the color of his skin. She had clutched his arm then, too, whispering the same plea. "Please don't fight. Just get through this." "I can't," Harold said softly. His voice trembled, not with anger, but with the weight of choice. "Not anymore." Clara's lips pressed together. She turned her gaze back to the window, blinking hard, as if the distant lights on the horizon could anchor her away from what was unfolding. Minutes passed, thick with anticipation. Passengers shifted uneasily. A man in row 3 muttered something about delays. Emily Vargas adjusted her phone, angling it discreetly while pretending to scroll. The young couple, Nathan and Olivia Ward, exchanged smirks as though they had already been promised something Harold and Clara were merely borrowing. When the curtain parted again, Thomas returned, his jaw set like stone. Janet trailed behind him, her expression taut, her voice low but audible enough for nearby passengers to catch. "Mr. Bennett," Thomas began, his tone sharpened. "This is your final notice. If you continue to refuse, we will have to report your noncompliance to the captain and involve security at our next opportunity." Harold stayed seated, his back straight, his hands folded calmly in his lap. He looked Thomas directly in the eye. "I am not refusing. I am sitting in the seat I purchased. That is not noncompliance. That is common sense." The clarity of his words rippled through the cabin. A woman across the aisle raised her eyebrows. Someone further back muttered, "He's right." Still, Thomas didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his voice dropping into something colder. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. If you cooperate, you'll avoid unnecessary consequences. If you don't—" He let the words hang, unfinished but heavy. Harold felt Clara trembling beside him. She squeezed his arm, her nails pressing into his sleeve. He turned slightly, catching her eyes, and saw tears threatening. In that moment, he wanted nothing more than to protect her peace, to erase the fear tightening her chest. But dignity, his and hers, was also protection. To surrender now would not quiet the storm. It would only plant its seeds deeper. He inhaled, then exhaled slowly, the way he had coached countless patients to do before a surgery. "We are not moving," he said again, His voice was steady, deliberate, unyielding. Thomas's nostrils flared. He straightened, exchanged a sharp look with Janet, and retreated without another word. The silence that followed was louder than any announcement. Whispers spread like ripples in water. Phones shifted subtly in hands. Some passengers looked away, unwilling to engage. Others stared openly, their faces etched with curiosity, discomfort, or quiet solidarity. Clara leaned close, her whisper trembling. Why are they doing this? Wyatt's Harold closed his eyes for a moment, the question sinking into him. Why us? It was a question he had asked countless times in countless ways. Why his scholarship application was nearly thrown out. Why a colleague once assumed he was a janitor instead of a surgeon. Why decades of expertise still couldn't erase the suspicion in strangers' eyes. Tonight, it was why two elderly passengers, celebrating 45 years of marriage, were being treated as trespassers in seats they had purchased. He opened his eyes, met Clara's, and spoke with quiet conviction. Because they think we don't belong. But we do, and I won't let them decide otherwise. Clara's breath shuddered. She nodded faintly, though her fear didn't fade. At the back of the cabin, Emily pressed Riekert. She framed Harold's calm expression, Clara's trembling hand, and the empty stares of the crew as they moved away. She didn't know why she felt compelled, only that something important was happening, something bigger than a seat dispute. The flight carried on in uneasy suspension. Trays rattled as drinks were served. Passengers adjusted pillows and blankets, but the tension in row 1 refused to dissolve. Harold sat steady, his hand resting lightly on Clara's, his gaze fixed forward as if bracing for turbulence that had nothing to do with the weather. Inside, his thoughts churned. He remembered his father's voice, long gone now, telling him as a boy, "Dignity will cost you, Harold, but losing it will cost you more." He remembered the patients he had lost, the ones who taught him that life can vanish in seconds, and he wondered if tonight would become another kind of lesson, another kind of loss. Clara's whisper broke through again, barely audible. What if they call the police? Harold turned to her, kissed her hand, and whispered back, "Then they call, but we stand." She closed her eyes, her lips trembling. As the cabin lights dimmed for the night flight, row 1 remained under a spotlight of invisible pressure. Each minute stretched, heavy with the knowledge that the next step would not be negotiation, but confrontation. Harold could feel it in the air, as surely as he could feel a patient's pulse beneath his fingertips. Something irreversible was coming. He leaned back, drew Clara closer, and whispered the only promise he could make. "Whatever happens, we stay together." And in the rows behind, passengers waited, phones ready, hearts unsettled, as the flight hurtled deeper into the night sky toward the breaking point. The hours of night flights always seemed suspended in an unreal quiet. But in row 1 of Flight 761 the silence was suffocating. Clara sat stiffly, her hand trembling inside Harold's, her breaths shallow. Harold kept his eyes forward, his posture calm, though inside his chest a storm raged. He could hear the faint murmurs of attendants behind the curtain, the quick static of a radio being used, the unmistakable urgency of preparations being made for escalation. He had seen this pattern before. First, the polite request, then the hardened demand, then the arrival of authority. It was a script as old as the country itself, played out in different rooms, on different stages, but always with the same conclusion. Tonight, the stage just happened to be an airplane at 35,000 feet. Clara leaned toward him, her voice trembling. "Harold, I can't take this. My chest feels tight." He turned immediately, eyes sharpening, scanning her face the way he had scanned thousands of patients before surgery. Her skin had lost some of its warmth. Her pulse raced beneath his fingertips. Fear was pressing on her heart as surely as any illness. He cupped her hand in both of his and whispered, "Stay with me. Love. Breathe slow, in and out. I'm here." The curtain pulled back. Thomas Keene reappeared, his expression colder than before. Behind him, 2 uniformed airport security officers stepped into the cabin. The sight alone was enough to ripple through the rows, conversations halting, heads swiveling. Emily Vargas lifted her phone higher, her camera now locked on the unfolding scene. "Sir," one officer began, voice stern, "you need to come with us immediately." Harold turned his head slowly, keeping his tone calm, deliberate. "On what grounds you've been deemed non-compliant and disruptive to flight operations?" the officer replied. His words were mechanical, rehearsed. Clara gasped. "He's done nothing wrong." Her voice cracked, raw and trembling. Harold raised his hand slightly, palms open. "There's no need to touch me. I can walk." He stood carefully, his jacket draped over his arm, his posture dignified. But before he could take a step, Clara's breath hitched violently. She gripped the armrest, her chest rising in short, sharp gasps. Then, with a strangled cry, her body slumped forward. Clara Harold's voice broke through the stunned silence. He spun from the officers, dropping to his knees beside her. "She's not breathing. Someone call for medical help now." The cabin erupted. Passengers gasped, voices shouted, a man yelled, "Get oxygen!" Another cried, "Is anyone a doctor?" Harold was already at work, his instincts as a physician taken over. He tilted Clara's head back, checking for breath. Nothing. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, his own heart pounding as he searched for the pulse he had felt thousands of times before in others. Faint, weak. "Clara, stay with me," he whispered, his voice trembling as he began compressions against her chest. A woman rushed forward from row 3. "I'm a nurse," she cried. Together they worked in urgent rhythm. Another attendant stumbled with the defibrillator, fumbling to open its case. Passengers craned their necks, some standing, others frozen with shock. Emily's camera shook but never wavered, capturing every frantic second. Nathan and Olivia Ward, the couple meant to take the seats, sat paralyzed, their earlier confidence dissolved into horror. "Get the AED pads on her chest," Harold commanded, his voice steady despite the terror inside him. Now, the machine whirred to life. The nurse placed the pads while Harold counted compressions. Clara's blouse was cut open in seconds, her pale skin illuminated under the cabin lights. The defibrillator beeped. "Analyzing. Shock advised." The mechanical voice announced. "Clear." Harold barked, his voice filling the cabin. Passengers flinched as Clara's body jolted. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then her chest rose faintly, a shallow breath scraping its way back into her body. "She's breathing," the nurse said, relief flooding her voice. Harold pressed his forehead to Clara's damp hair. Whispering through tears he refused to let fall. "Stay with me. Baby. Please. Just stay." The captain's voice cut through the intercom. "Grave. Ladies and gentlemen, We have a medical emergency on board. We are returning to Newark immediately. Please remain seated." The plane tilted, banking sharply. Attendants scrambled. Passengers whispered, some crying, some filming, others praying silently. Harold remained at Clara's side, gripping her hand tightly. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. He could feel her pulse now, fragile but present. Janet Rhodes hovered near the galley, her face pale, her composure shattered. She avoided Harold's eyes, her hands trembling as she clutched a clipboard to her chest. Thomas Keene, usually so certain, stood stiffly by the officers, his authority hollow in the wake of what had just unfolded. "You see what you've caused," a passenger shouted angrily toward the crew. "This is on you." Another voice chimed in. "They paid for those seats. This is discrimination. Phones recorded. Fingers pointed." The cabin had transformed into a courtroom midair. The evidence undeniable. The witnesses many. Harold bent closer to Clara, his voice tender, desperate. "You're still here. That's all that matters. Just stay." The plane descended quickly, the runway lights growing closer. Emergency crews were already waiting when the wheels screeched against the tarmac. Within minutes, paramedics boarded, rushing down the aisle with equipment. They lifted Clara onto a stretcher, her frail body surrounded by wires and oxygen tubes. Harold followed closely, never letting go of her hand. Cameras flashed the moment they emerged into the terminal. Reporters had already been tipped off, lenses trained on the elderly black doctor and his wife being wheeled into the night. "Sir, did they cause your wife's collapse?" One shouted. Harold didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on Clara, on the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, on the fragile thread tethering her to life. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, he climbed in beside her, clutching her hand as the siren wailed. Outside, the cameras kept rolling. Passengers spilled into the terminal with their own footage, and somewhere in the crowd, Emily Vargas uploaded her video with shaken fingers. The caption she typed was simple but devastating. They tried to take his seat. His wife collapsed minutes later. This is America in 2025. By morning, the video would be everywhere. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Machines beeped in steady rhythms, each one a reminder of how fragile life could become in a matter of minutes. Harold sat at Clara's bedside, his shoulders slumped in a way no patient had ever seen from him. His hand wrapped around hers as though he could anchor her back to consciousness through touch alone. Clara's chest rose and fell, shallow but steady, oxygen hissing faintly through a clear mask. A nurse adjusted the IV line and whispered something reassuring, though Harold barely heard it. His mind was a churn of memory and fear, the weight of the night pressing down harder with every minute that passed. His suit jacket was still wrinkled from the flight, his shirt damp with sweat. On the floor beside his chair, his carry-on lay forgotten, one strap twisted. Outside the room, wheels squeaked against tile as orderlies moved carts of supplies. The world kept spinning. But Harold's had narrowed to this sterile room, to the woman who had given up so much so he could rise, now lying still under fluorescent lights. He leaned forward, brushing a lock of gray hair from Clara's forehead. "You're still here," he whispered. "Stay here with me, please." The memory of the cabin replayed in his mind like a cruel loop, the officer's hand on his arm. Clara's sudden collapse, the panic in passengers' voices, the weight of helplessness crashing down as he fought for her life in front of strangers. He had faced death before, countless times in operating rooms, but never like this. Never with Clara. At 4:07 after hours of sitting in silence broken only by the hiss of machines. Harold stood, his legs ached, his back stiff, but something inside him had sharpened. He stepped into the hallway, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over a name he hadn't called in years. Marcus Hale, when the line clicked and a groggy voice answered. Harold spoke only 3 words. It happened. Marcus. A pause. Then Marcus's voice hardened, fully awake. Where are you, Saint? Matthews Medical, Newark. ICU. Harold swallowed. Aerosky Flight 761. They dragged me off the plane. Clara collapsed. She's fighting for her life. Silence filled the line, heavy and electric. Finally, Marcus said, do you want press or lawsuits both? Harold answered without hesitation. His voice was low, steady, edged with grief. I want them to regret every second they thought they could take our dignity. I'll be there by noon, Marcus said, and I'll bring everything. When Harold returned to the room, Clara's breathing had steadied into a fragile rhythm. He sank back into the chair, exhaustion tugging at him, but his resolve now sat solid in his chest. The choice had been made. This would not end with apologies whispered in corporate hallways. By sunrise, the first ripples had already reached the outside world. Emily Vargas's video spread across social media with breathtaking speed. 2 million views before morning, captions and hashtags multiplying by the second. Justice for Clara, seats not skin, dignity in flight. Comment sections ignited with fury. She looks terrified. This is profiling, plain and simple. I've flown first class with my husband. We were never asked to move. Never. Cable news picked up the footage within hours. Anchors with grave faces narrated the scene. Pausing the video at the moment, officers reached for Harold, replaying Clara's collapse again and again. Chirons flashed bold letters, elderly black couple, targeted on flight, wife hospitalized, at St. Matthews. Harold sat hunched forward, listening with half an ear as a nurse explained medications. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages, many from numbers he didn't recognize. He silenced most of them. Only one call mattered. By 2 p.m., Marcus Hale walked into the hospital conference room, a leather briefcase in one hand and the air of a man who had weathered battles far louder than this. Harold rose to meet him, the 2 men embracing briefly, a wordless recognition of both friendship and the gravity of what lay ahead. Marcus's team followed a junior associate already shuffling papers, a media strategist tapping notes into her tablet, and an investigator specializing in airline discrimination cases. They sat around the table, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the air thick with determination. They think you'll take a settlement, Marcus said bluntly, cash, an NDA, and a public statement clearing them of wrongdoing. That's already being drafted. They'll push it hard. Harold's lips pressed tight. He glanced toward the hallway where Clara lay. I don't want their money. I want their silence broken. Good, Marcus said, his tone fierce, because they're not just offering cash. They want your name clearing them. They're scared. Harold chuckled bitterly. So they want me to apologize for being assaulted? Pretty much. Harold leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Then, let's make them regret asking. Marcus's eyes glinted with something sharp. That's exactly what we'll do. The next 48 hours blurred into a storm. Witnesses began contacting Marcus's office. passengers who had been on the flight reaching out with statements. One woman described overhearing attendants joke before boarding, saying, "Some people think a ticket makes them royalty." Another provided a screenshot of a text sent mid-flight. "They're dragging this old black man off. No idea why." Meanwhile, Harold's medical credentials became public knowledge. He wasn't just a passenger, he was Dr. Harold Bennett, one of Newark's most respected cardiologists, a man who had saved thousands of lives. His hospital released a statement of support. The local physicians' union echoed it. Black medical associations across the country rallied behind him. News coverage shifted from shock to outrage. This wasn't just a seat dispute. One anchor said, this was systemic bias playing out at 35,000 feet. Inside the ICU, Harold rarely left Clara's side. He read to her from the Psalms, his voice low and steady. He adjusted her blanket when nurses bustled in. He whispered stories from their early days, hoping some fragment would reach her through the fog. Each beep of the monitor kept him tethered, each shallow breath reminding him of what was at stake. But when he wasn't at her bedside, he was with Marcus, reviewing evidence, preparing for the fight. The airline had underestimated him, assuming age and grief would weaken his resolve. They didn't know Harold Bennett. They didn't know the decades he had spent mastering patience, precision, and endurance. The same qualities that had made him a brilliant surgeon would now make him an unmovable adversary. By the third day, the video had reached 10 million views. Hashtags trended worldwide. Protests erupted outside Aerosky's headquarters in New York, signs reading, "First class doesn't mean second-class people and accountability at 35,000 feet." When the airline finally released a statement, it was cold, clinical. "We regret the unfortunate medical emergency that occurred on Flight 761. We are conducting an internal review and extend our sympathies to those involved." Harold read it twice, his lips tight, not his name, not Clara's. No acknowledgement of the actions that triggered the collapse. Just a medical emergency, as though the crew hadn't manufactured the stress that had nearly killed his wife. He folded the paper and set it aside. "They still don't see us," he murmured. Marcus leaned across the table. "Then we'll make them." And so the storm gathered. By the fourth day after the flight, the hospital felt less like a sanctuary and more like a command center. Reporters clustered outside the sliding glass doors, their cameras poised, waiting for even a glimpse of Harold Bennett walking through the lobby. Protesters gathered with signs and chants, their voices echoing through the parking lot. Seats not, skin justice for Clara. Accountability at 35,000 feet inside. Harold remained mostly at Clara's side. He read to her in soft tones, smoothed the blanket across her chest, whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Every so often, her fingers twitched against his palm, a faint reminder that she was still fighting. Those small movements kept him upright when exhaustion tried to drag him down. But he also knew the fight was no longer only about Clara. The world outside was watching, demanding. And so, each day, he split himself in two. Half the husband, half the reluctant symbol of a growing movement. Marcus Hale moved with relentless precision. On the morning of the fifth day, he spread documents across the hospital conference table, his voice brisk. "We filed today. Not a warning, not a press statement, a federal civil rights lawsuit, racial discrimination, emotional distress, reckless endangerment. This isn't about compensation. It's about accountability. Harold studied the papers. Legal jargon swam before his eyes, but the weight of it settled in his chest. His name, Clara's name, Aerosky Airways stamped in bold across the top. He exhaled slowly, then nodded. Do it. By noon, the lawsuit was filed. National news outlets picked up the story within the hour. Headlines blazed across screens: elderly couple files civil rights, lawsuit against Aerosky, Flight 761, incident sparks, federal case. Cable networks replayed Emily Vargas's video on a loop. The caption bar beneath reading, "The first-class incident." The airline released a new statement almost immediately. Carefully worded by a team of lawyers and PR specialists, "We are disappointed by this legal action. We remain confident in the professionalism of our crew and their adherence to safety protocols. We extend our sympathies to the Bennett family during this time." Harold read the statement in silence. Marcus shook his head, muttering, "Professionalism. They call dragging a man from his paid seat professionalism?" Harold's lips pressed into a thin line. "They still don't see us. They only see their liability." The tide, however, was shifting beyond the airline's control. Civil rights organizations announced support within hours. The NAACP released a statement of solidarity. Physicians' groups across the country rallied behind Harold, citing not only his decades of service but also the wider pattern of discrimination faced by black professionals in spaces of privilege. The most damning blow came late that evening when Marcus's investigator slid a USB drive across the conference table. "You'll want to see this before they make it disappear," she said grimly. The drive contained gate footage, leaked by an anonymous source inside Aerosky's compliance department. High-definition video captured every second of Harold and Clara's boarding, the way they approached calmly, smiling, their passports in hand. The agent's double-take when she read their names, the sideways glance she shared with her colleague, the whispered exchange, barely audible on the recording but visible in posture and expression. The footage shifted to two attendants huddled at the jet bridge. One pointed toward the boarding door. Her words clear enough to read on her lips. "I don't care what his title is. They don't look like they belong up there." 6 words that ignited the internet like a match dropped into dry grass. By the next morning, hashtags multiplied. "They don't look like." "They belong" trended worldwide. Memes, commentaries, think pieces flooded social media. Talk show hosts condemned the airline on live television. Late-night comedians wove the phrase into biting monologues. Harold didn't watch most of it. He couldn't. But Marcus insisted the footage was their strongest weapon. They can deny intent all they want. This shows it, plain as day. This isn't one bad decision. It's systemic bias caught on tape. Witnesses stepped forward, emboldened by the attention. Former flight attendants shared anonymous stories online, confessing that they had been told to manage the brand image of first class. One admitted her voice altered for anonymity on a podcast. "We were never told explicitly to move black or Latino passengers, but it was implied. Keep first class looking consistent. That's what they said." Another went public, her face visible, her voice clear. "I quit because I couldn't stomach it anymore. I watched a black father and his daughter humiliated last year when their upgrade was revoked without cause. This isn't isolated. It's a pattern." The lawsuit gained momentum. Civil rights lawyers across the country volunteered support. A prominent senator tweeted, "We need a congressional inquiry into discriminatory airline practices." Flight 761 is not an isolated incident. Inside the hospital. Harold continued his vigil. Each night, after long days of strategy meetings and interviews he never wanted to give. He returned to Clara's bedside. He read aloud from the worn Bible they had carried on every trip. He told her about their grandchildren's latest antics. He whispered about Paris, about the necklace still waiting in her suitcase, about the years they still had ahead of them if only she would stay. But beneath the tenderness, a storm brewed inside him. He remembered Thomas Keene's cold stare, Janet Rhodes's clipped tone, the officer's mechanical words. He remembered the way passengers whispered, some recording, others pretending not to see, and he wondered, late at night, when exhaustion pressed hardest, if his refusal had cost Clara too much. "Did I do this to you?" he whispered one night, his voice cracking as he held her hand. "Did I hold too firm? Was protecting our dignity worth the price you're paying?" Now Clara didn't answer, her breaths shallow and steady, but somewhere deep inside, Harold knew the truth. Yielding would not have protected her. Yielding would only have buried the wound deeper. This was not a new injury. It was the culmination of decades. Tonight, it had simply erupted into the lot. On the 10th day, the pre-trial hearing was scheduled. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, activists, and curious citizens. Protesters filled the steps outside, their chants echoing down city blocks. Signs waved, "Dignity is not negotiable. First class, not second-class people." Harold entered the courtroom in a dark suit, his face unreadable, his back straight. Marcus walked beside him, papers stacked high in his arms. Cameras flashed, capturing the image of an elderly black doctor walking into battle not with rage, but with quiet, immovable resolve. Inside, Aerosky's lawyers argued that the crew had acted within protocol, that safety concerns justified their actions, that Clara's collapse was an unrelated medical event. Harold sat silently, his hands folded, his expression a mask. But when the defense attorney uttered the words "unrelated medical event," something in his jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening against his lap. Marcus rose, his voice sharp as he introduced the first exhibit. Passenger complaint data spanning 10 years, showing disproportionate removal of black and brown passengers from first class, internal emails recovered during discovery, jokes about passengers who don't fit the look, training slides leaked by a whistleblower, images of only white passengers under the caption "Premium Cabin Presentation." The courtroom shifted, murmurs rippling like a wave. Harold sat still, but inside, the storm quieted just slightly. This was what he had wanted. Not vengeance, not spectacle, truth, exposed in daylight, undeniable, unerasable. When the session adjourned, Marcus leaned close and whispered, "This is only the beginning. They wanted your silence. Instead, you gave them a movement." Harold glanced toward the courthouse steps where chants still roared. He thought of Clara lying in her hospital bed, still tethered to machines. He thought of the decades of quiet endurance that had led them here. He thought of the words he had written in his notebook. Long ago, "Dignity is not negotiable." And for the first time since the flight, he allowed himself the faintest smile. By the morning of the 6th day, the world seemed to have contracted around the events of Flight 761. Screens across newsrooms flickered with footage of protest signs waving outside Newark Liberty Airport. Social media buzzed relentlessly. Hashtags crawling across every platform, "Justice for Clara." Airline accountability, Seats, not skin. Each notification on Harold's phone made his stomach tighten, yet he could not turn away. He had to see, had to understand the scope of what had erupted beyond the confines of the hospital room. The airline, Aerosky Airways, was spiraling internally. Executives in glass-paneled offices barked at assistants. The phone lines flooded with media inquiries, and staff who had once walked the cabin with calm assurance now hovered nervously near passengers, afraid that another incident might ignite the already furious public. Flight manifests were being rechecked, seating policies reviewed, and compliance officers scrambled to draft public statements. Harold, however, was not thinking about the chaos within the airline. He was thinking about Clara, and more urgently, about what he should have done on that flight. His mind played the moment over and over, the polite request from Janet Rhodes, the insistence, the subtle power dynamic that escalated without reason. He questioned himself in quiet whispers when no one was listening. Should he have spoken louder? Should he have protested differently? Or was the confrontation inevitable? A culmination of years of systemic prejudice that could not be avoided, even with perfect behavior. Clara, when she was awake, was calm but introspective. Her once bright eyes were now rimmed with faint shadows, the toll of the incident clear on her delicate frame. "Harold," she said one morning, her voice soft but steady. "We can't change the world by ourselves, but we can make them see it." Her words sank into him, and he realized the paradox of his situation. He was both a victim and an unlikely catalyst. He did not want the attention. He had spent a lifetime healing hearts, not taking headlines, yet the world had chosen him. Or perhaps he had chosen to accept it by calling Marcus Hale in the first place. That single call had lit a fuse, and now the explosion could not be contained. Inside the cabin of public opinion, allegiances formed quickly. Supporters of Harold and Clara flooded comment sections and news forums, sharing personal stories of discrimination, moments of humiliation, and quiet indignities experienced on flights and in airports across the country. Some had encountered policies that made them feel invisible, overlooked, or second class. Others remained silent observers, fearful but quietly nodding in recognition. Meanwhile, the airline's legal team began to feel the pressure. Drafting statements was no longer enough. They had to anticipate public sentiment, prepare for lawsuits, and respond to regulators. The narrative was slipping away from them, driven by raw human empathy for the Bennetts and the undeniable injustice they had endured. Every executive knew that a single misstep could make this a national scandal, one that would follow the company for years. Harold, in his quiet moments beside Clara, felt the weight of all these forces pressing down. He was not only managing the very personal task of helping his wife recover, but he also had to navigate the uncharted territory of becoming the public face of a movement. Each time a notification buzzed, each time a hashtag trended higher, he felt a mixture of fear, responsibility, and moral obligation. The quiet man who had spent a lifetime inside hospitals and lecture halls now found himself at the center of a storm far beyond the predictable rhythm of his life. The media frenzy had another effect, subtle but profound. It reminded Harold and Clara of their mortality, of the brevity of human attention and life, sitting in that sterile hospital room. Harold often looked out the window at the city skyline, imagining the world outside rushing on as if none of this had happened. Yet inside, in the microcosm of the room, each breath, each pulse, Each heartbeat mattered immensely. Clara's hand in his reminded him that while the world's attention could be a tide, the human connection, the lived experience of trust, care, and love was something entirely personal and non-negotiable. The couple's story began to spread across news outlets beyond national networks. Regional papers published essays detailing their journey. Reporters visited friends and family for interviews, and the narrative of a life interrupted by bias resonated in communities across the country. Yet, for Harold, the headlines were not the goal. The story was a tool, a magnifying glass to expose the subtle, systemic inequalities that had allowed such an incident to occur on a plane, under the watchful eyes of dozens of passengers who had done nothing to intervene. Harold's internal struggle deepened during these days. There was a persistent voice in his head that questioned his own actions. Could he have handled it differently? Was he letting fear dictate his decisions even now, as the world watched and waited for his next move? Every time he considered speaking to reporters or taking public action, he had to weigh the immediate consequences against the long-term impact on both Clara's health and the movement he had inadvertently become a symbol of. Clara, sensing his turmoil, would squeeze his hand and remind him gently, "We do not owe them our fear. Harold, our courage is enough, and it is needed more than ever." Those words settled over him like a balm, giving him the fortitude to navigate both the intimate and public challenges that had converged into this unprecedented moment. While the media frenzy grew, Aerosky Airways tried to regain control. Employees whispered among themselves about how one flight could redefine the company's public image. Cabin staff rehearsed polite forms of communication. Legal counsel instructed executives on what could and could not be said. Yet every corrective measure felt like pouring water into a storm. The momentum of public empathy, outrage, and collective demand for accountability could not be contained by corporate protocol alone. Harold realized, as he watched the headlines scroll across multiple screens, that the story was no longer about him and Clara alone. It had become a reflection of societal values, a mirror for every unnoticed indignity and subtle act of prejudice. The flight, the seats, the narrow aisle, everything had become a symbol of a larger truth. For Harold, this realization carried both a heavy responsibility and a strange sense of relief. At last, what had happened to them would not be hidden, would not be whispered about in hushed tones. The world was watching, and perhaps that attention could be transformed into change. Yet the anxiety never fully dissipated. Harold could feel it in the quiet spaces between media interviews, in the pauses when he looked at Clara and wondered if she fully understood the storm their lives had entered. The balance between personal grief and public obligation was delicate, and he knew it would test him in ways nothing else ever had. Each time he stepped away from the hospital bed for a brief respite, the notifications, hashtags, and news feeds reminded him that the outside world would not wait, and neither could he. This was the new reality. One phone call had ignited a movement. One flight had revealed deep-seated injustices, and one couple's courage, measured in quiet persistence, was now a beacon for millions who had felt powerless for too long. Harold and Clara Bennett had survived the immediate trauma, but the journey ahead, legal, emotional, and societal, was only just beginning. The hospital room had settled into a fragile routine. Monitors beeped in soft, predictable rhythms. Nurses moved with quiet efficiency, almost reverent in their caution around Clara Bennett. Harold sat in his usual chair, slouched just enough to release tension in his shoulders, yet upright enough to react instantly if she stirred. Each moment brought a mix of relief and dread. Clara's chest rose steadily, her fingers occasionally twitching under the thin hospital blanket, but the knowledge of what had happened, the humiliation, the dragging from the seat, the public spectacle remained etched in Harold's mind, sharper than any scalpel he had ever held. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a pause, a breath that was purely for him. Even now, the fight felt unfair. He had spent a lifetime in hospitals, treating patients with broken hearts and fractured bodies, and yet there was nothing in any medical manual that prepared him for watching the love of his life torn from her dignity by strangers wielding authority. The thought gnawed at him, feeding a quiet anger that he could not ignore. Marcus Hale had arrived that morning, briefcase in hand, the faint leather scent mingling with the sterile smell of antiseptic. Harold rose to greet him, a stiff formality masking the storm of gratitude and frustration brewing within him. Marcus had always been meticulous, uncompromising in the courtroom, a man who fought with every ounce of strategy and intellect he possessed. Today, he was here not only as Harold's legal counsel, but as the instrument to channel the public outrage into actionable pressure. "We've collected everything," Marcus said, placing a thick folder on the table, video footage from the cabin, witness statements, communications from the airline before and after the flight. "The public narrative is on our side, Harold, but we have to be precise. No mistakes." Harold nodded, absorbing the weight of it. "I just want Clara to be safe," he said quietly. "Everything else we can handle later." Marcus's gaze softened. "I know. That's why we're doing this together. You don't have to shoulder it alone, but remember, Harold, the world is watching. Every detail matters." The next hours passed in a blur. They reviewed footage, frame by frame, annotating moments where the flight attendant's demeanor shifted, where words like non-compliant and disruptive were whispered or broadcast. Harold felt a pang in his chest each time Clara's face appeared, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. He realized that while he had been trained to measure vitals and administer interventions, this was a different battlefield, one where empathy and strategy collided in unpredictable ways. Late in the afternoon, Harold found himself alone in the room, staring at Clara's still form. He ran his fingers over the back of her hand, tracing the faint lines and veins, the small imperfections that made her human, real, and profoundly irreplaceable. His mind wandered to the flight itself, the polite smiles that had preceded the encounter, the abrupt demand to switch seats, the cold efficiency with which security had boarded. He relived it moment by moment, questioning whether he could have anticipated it, prevented it, or done something differently. The weight of what if pressed against him relentlessly. By evening, the media outside had grown louder. Helicopters hovered faintly in the distance, their rotors a persistent reminder that the outside world had not forgotten them. Protesters chanted, their voices amplified by bullhorns, waving banners and photographs. Harold could hear fragments of their slogans: justice, dignity, accountability. They were powerful, yet he knew that each chant, each headline, was another wave in a tide that could either lift them or drown them. He sat in silence for several minutes, allowing the external chaos to merge with his internal turbulence. Memories of Clara laughing during earlier trips, the comfort of her hand in his during long nights, The subtle warmth of her presence, even in silence, all these recollections fueled a determination inside him. He could not allow this incident to remain a private scar. It had become a public symbol, a testament to the indignities that too many endured quietly. And Harold Bennett, the calm, measured man who had saved lives with precision and care, realized he would now have to save something far less tangible, the principle of justice itself. Marcus returned as twilight fell over the city. He moved efficiently, consulting on filings, preparing statements, and strategizing for media appearances. Harold watched him, a strange mixture of admiration and fatigue washing over him. The legal battle would not be easy, but it would be necessary. Each document filed, each statement released, each headline analyzed brought a measure of control back to Harold, a way to channel the helplessness that had gripped him during the flight into purposeful action. Late that night, when the hospital had quieted and only the faint hum of machines filled the space, Harold finally allowed himself to sit back and exhale. He gazed at Clara, her chest rising and falling steadily, and whispered promises that were both personal and public. "We will get through this, you and I, together, and we will make sure the world sees what happened here. No one else should have to go through what you did." For a long moment, he just sat, feeling the pulse of her hand beneath his, the faint rhythm of the machines, the distant echoes of a world that would soon demand answers. And in that space, Harold Bennett realized that the fight ahead was no longer just about one flight, one couple, one moment in time. It was about a system, a culture, and a principle that had been quietly eroded for too long. He would face it with patience, precision, and the unwavering resolve that had carried him through a lifetime of challenges. Outside, the city lights twinkled like distant stars, indifferent to the human struggles unfolding below. But inside that small hospital room, amidst machines, papers, and whispered reassurances, Harold Bennett understood something profound. The world could be watched, measured, and eventually changed. One deliberate action at a time, and he was ready to begin. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and muted anxiety. The hum of the air conditioning mingled with the shuffling of papers and the distant echo of footsteps on marble floors. Harold Bennett adjusted the cuff of his sleeve for what felt like the 100th time, though he knew it made no difference to his nerves. His palms were dry but clammy, a subtle contradiction that mirrored the battle inside him. Clara sat beside him, her hand lightly brushing his, a silent reassurance that grounded him amidst the storm of legal and public scrutiny. The courtroom filled quickly, a mixture of spectators, reporters, and legal aides. Cameras perched strategically on tripods, their lenses trained on the row of plaintiffs and defendants. The murmurs of the crowd were a background rhythm, steady yet suffocating. Harold felt every eye, every whispered speculation, but he refused to let it unmoor him. He had spent decades as a physician, a man who had seen life and death swing with every heartbeat. This was different. This was about dignity, about justice, and the invisible yet palpable lines society often drew around people like him and Clara. Marcus Hale moved to the front, his suit sharp, his voice calm but deliberate. He carried the weight of preparation, the assurance that came from knowledge of the law, and the confidence that the evidence would stand. His opening statement was precise, laying out the events of Flight 761 with clarity. He spoke of the humiliation, the abrupt removal of Harold from his seat, the subsequent medical crisis involving Clara, and the airline's failure to manage the situation responsibly. Every word struck like a chisel, carving a narrative that demanded attention. Harold felt a tremor of disbelief as he listened. The memories of that night were vivid the moment the flight attendant had ordered him to move. The polite refusal, the sudden shift in cabin atmosphere, and then the arrival of security. He remembered the young, entitled couple who had watched silently, their expressions unreadable but charged with judgment. The labels non-compliant and disruptive still rang in his ears, and now they were being dissected in the sterile light of a courtroom. Clara's eyes, though weary, followed him closely. Harold could see the flicker of fear, the residual pain, but also something more, a quiet, unyielding strength. She had been through more than anyone should endure in a single night, and yet she remained composed, her presence anchoring him even as the courtroom seemed to swell with tension. When it was his turn to speak, Harold rose slowly. The room seemed to pause, waiting for his voice. He spoke clearly, each word measured, each sentence carefully structured to convey both fact and feeling. He described the flight, the moments leading up to the confrontation, the sudden escalation, and the immediate aftermath. He spoke of Clara's reaction, the medical crisis, and the lingering trauma that neither of them could easily shake. Yet, even as he recounted the events, there was a controlled calmness in his tone, a deliberate choice to channel grief and anger into something purposeful. The airline's defense attorney countered with rehearsed precision, questioning every detail, implying exaggeration, and attempting to minimize the emotional and physical toll of the incident. Harold anticipated each line of questioning. He had prepared for this, rehearsed the facts, and built his resilience on decades of focus and discipline. The courtroom became a theater, but unlike any stage he had known, the stakes were human lives, dignity, and the message that injustice, no matter how subtle or institutionalized, could not go unanswered. Throughout the testimony, Harold wrestled internally. Anger bubbled beneath the surface, but he tempered it with clarity. He recalled the lessons from his years in medicine: patience, observation, and empathy. He focused on those moments, letting them guide his words. Each phrase, each recollection was an attempt to balance truth with integrity. The courtroom was not just a battleground for him, it was a platform to honor Clara's courage and to challenge systemic patterns of discrimination. Outside, the movement had grown. Social media channels buzzed with clips from the courtroom. Hashtags gained traction, and news anchors debated the implications. Protesters held signs outside the courthouse, their chants resonating through the city streets. The story of Flight 761 was no longer just about an incident on a plane. It had become a symbol, a reflection of societal fault lines, and a reminder that courage often demands visibility and resistance. When the day ended, Harold left the courtroom with Clara beside him. Their hands were entwined, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. They walked slowly, absorbing the weight of the day, the burden of the public gaze, and the quiet victory of having told their story. It was a moment of fragile triumph, tempered by the knowledge that the fight was not yet over, but strengthened by the undeniable truth that they had reclaimed their dignity in a world eager to deny it. The hotel room that night was silent, the city lights filtering softly through the curtains. Harold and Clara sat together, reflecting not just on the courtroom battle but on the intimacy of shared survival. He marveled at her strength, her ability to endure fear and humiliation with grace. And in that quiet space, removed from cameras and spectators, he allowed himself to feel the full depth of emotion he had carried since that night in the cabin. Harold Bennett had been a man of science and reason, of measured action and careful thought. Yet he also realized that courage required more than skill. It required the willingness to stand when injustice loomed, to speak when silence felt safer, and to act when passivity would have been easier. And Clara, beside him, was both witness and partner in this revelation. Together, they embodied resilience, humanity, and the quiet yet unyielding demand for justice that would continue to echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom. The courtroom was hushed as the judge's gavel struck, echoing across the polished oak and marble. Harold sat with Clara at his side, hands intertwined, a quiet tension threading through the room. Every argument, every witness, every bit of damning evidence had culminated in this moment. The airline's counsel had tried to minimize the incident, framing it as a procedural necessity, a minor disruption to a flawless operation. But the testimonies had painted a different picture, an elderly couple humiliated, a flight attendant's bias unchecked, security's heavy-handed response, and the cascade of consequences that followed. Harold felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief mingled with exhaustion. Triumph mingled with sorrow. He had spent decades practicing medicine, healing others, and now he was part of a different kind of care, one that nurtured justice, dignity, and the recognition of humanity. Clara's fingers squeezed his, a small but powerful anchor. She was alive. She was recovering, and the world was starting to acknowledge the wrong that had been inflicted. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy reached its peak. Reporters jostled for position, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing incessantly. Protesters waved their signs, chanting slogans that now felt prophetic rather than reactive. Seats, not skin, had become more than a hashtag. It was a movement. The airline's public relations team scrambled to issue statements, their carefully drafted words unable to contain the ripple effect of social outrage. Airlines across the country were now reviewing their policies, training programs, and internal protocols. Inside, Harold reflected on the personal journey that had brought him here. He thought about the countless nights of study and work, the years of perseverance, the moments of quiet determination when no one else believed in him. He thought about Clara, her unwavering spirit, and the subtle ways she had always encouraged him to rise above the injustices of the world. Together, they had weathered storms that were not their own, and yet, together, they had emerged stronger. As the judge read the ruling, it was clear that justice had been acknowledged, if not fully restored. The airline was held accountable. Compensation was granted. Mandatory sensitivity training was ordered. Policies were revised. But for Harold, the ruling was not merely about money or policy. It was about acknowledgement, about the validation of a life lived with dignity and respect. It was about sending a message that discrimination, no matter how subtle or institutionalized, would not go unnoticed. In the quiet moments following the ruling, Harold found himself reflecting on broader societal truths. How often had people been labeled non-compliant, disruptive, or inconvenient simply because of the color of their skin, their age, or their quiet presence? How many moments of injustice were swept under the rug? Leaving wounds that festered silently, he realized that change required not only confrontation but also vigilance, empathy, and the courage to speak out, even when the world seemed indifferent. Clara's recovery continued. each day a testament to resilience. She regained strength slowly, often laughing softly at Harold's dry humor or the absurdity of the media circus that surrounded them. Together, they found small joys, afternoon walks, quiet dinners, and evenings spent reading by the window. Life had returned to its rhythm, but now with a heightened awareness of the fragility and preciousness of dignity. Harold knew the journey was far from over. Policies could be rewritten, lawsuits filed, and apologies issued, but societal attitudes would take longer to change. He accepted that challenge, determined to use his voice and experience to advocate for others who could not yet speak. He envisioned a world where air travel, like healthcare or education, was a space free from prejudice, where respect was not conditional, and where every individual could exist without fear of humiliation. At home, Harold and Clara sat together in the soft glow of the evening, their hands intertwined, the quiet hum of the city below, and the knowledge that they had survived something that could have destroyed them. But more than survival, they had contributed to a ripple that was larger than themselves, a movement that would inspire conversation, reflection, and perhaps, in small but meaningful ways, change. The story of Flight 761 became a lesson, a caution, and an inspiration. It reminded the world that even in confined spaces like airplanes, the human spirit could challenge injustice. It reminded those who witnessed it that dignity mattered, that every act of courage, even one quiet phone call, could have a ripple effect. And most importantly, it reminded Harold and Clara, and everyone who followed their journey, that resilience, empathy, and moral courage were the quiet engines that moved the world toward justice. As they looked at each other, the unspoken understanding was clear. Life was fragile, society imperfect, but hope and love were enduring. The flight, the confrontation, and the fight that followed were chapters in a larger story about humanity, empathy, and the courage to insist on what was right. And in that quiet reflection, Harold allowed himself to believe finally that the world could be better and that they could help shape it. The story of Harold and Clara Bennett reminds us that injustice can strike anywhere, even at 35,000 feet. But it also shows the resilience of the human spirit, Harold's unwavering calm, Clara's quiet strength, and the love that bound them together through fear and humiliation teach us that empathy and courage can confront even the harshest of prejudice. As the world watched, this flight became more than just a journey from one city to another. It became a mirror, reflecting societal biases and challenging us to examine how we treat one another in moments of power and vulnerability. The public outrage, the courtroom battles, and the collective voice demanding accountability highlight that change begins when we refuse to look away. Let this story linger with you not just as a tale of injustice, but as a call to act with compassion, to speak out against discrimination, and to value dignity over convenience. Love, respect, and humanity are worth defending everywhere, even in the skies. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Join us for more stories that reveal the power of courage, empathy, and justice in our world.